Information is Fundamental by Alfred Joyce. Video Part 3. 3. Perception shapes reality.
One might be tempted to ask, if information is never lost and always preserved, why doesn't everything last forever? With this question, vocabulary and the mixing of concepts creates confusion. The word everything in this question is being used in a way that means something other than information. But we've established everything is information, and therein lies the flaw in the question. So just to reiterate, information does indeed last forever. What doesn't last forever are the assigned entities, which are groupings of information as perceived by us. So let's explain how that happens. As information is being processed, we perceive certain groupings of information. Those perceived groupings of information are still constantly processing information. And through the eternal process of information processing, at some point, the perceived groupings of information will be perceived as having morphed into a different perceived grouping of information based on its characteristics and information being processed. Information has one essence and one characteristic. Groupings of information will have one essence and multiple emergent characteristics. And those multiple characteristics will dictate how the groupings of information are affected and perceived, but the information itself remains. Think of water. Water is the assigned entity consisting of a perceived grouping of information. In a cold enough environment, water will process information according to its characteristics and morph into ice. Information is preserved, but the particular grouping of information has morphed to where it is now perceived as ice and has a different set of characteristics. Every assigned entity, which is just a perceived grouping of information, is constantly processing information based on its numerous characteristics, whether we perceive the processing or not. And eventually, there comes a time when the initial perceived grouping of information is perceived to having morphed into a different perceived grouping of information based on its characteristics and all the constant information processing it goes through. Wear and tear is a perceivable example of that. Your favorite t-shirt will look different after 30 years because of its constant information processing. Its structure would have changed because some of its initial perceived grouping of information would have morphed when processing the grouping of information of the chemicals used to clean it. Some of the information of the group was lost/morphed into cleanliness, or when processing the information of the forces used when someone stretched it. Some of the information of the group was lost/morphed into stretching, and countless other information processes at all reality levels. So in some way or another, every perceived grouping of information will be perceived to having morphed into a different perceived grouping of information, creating the potential for different characteristics to emerge. And when that process results in a new perceived grouping of information featuring new characteristics, that's what we call death. A perceived grouping of information with its characteristics, which through the continuous process of information processing naturally morphs into a different perceived grouping of information with other characteristics. Yes, even death is information processing. From its perceived conception, an organism perceived as a grouping of information and corresponding characteristics will process information at all times. And throughout that continuous process, certain characteristics will emerge, affecting its perceived grouping of information. In a sense, each emergent stage is the death of the previous stage, although not necessarily of the organism. And one day, the resulting information processing of the perceived grouping of information will produce the characteristic of end organism's life given X perceived grouping of information. Meaning, when the organism morphs into a given X perceived grouping of information as a result of its information processing, its emergent characteristic is termination of emergent characteristic life when morphing into X perceived grouping of information which features emergent characteristic death, resulting in the death of the organism. On the outside, it may appear that the perceived grouping of information is intact because we still perceive the organism as a whole. But we know that within, amid a variety of information processes, the biological process has ended and the chemical process will continue and will in time exhibit different reactions to the environment than when life was present within the body, all of which is obviously a result of a different perceived grouping of information exhibiting different characteristics. And notice that information processing continues even after the death of the assigned entity, organism. Some perceived groupings of information exhibit life as an emergent characteristic for the assigned entity, and other perceived groupings of information exhibit death as an emergent characteristic for the assigned entity. It's a similar process to how water morphs into ice or vapor, depending on its perceived grouping of information and the information it's processing. Information processing and perceived groupings of information morphing is constant and continuous at all levels of reality simultaneously. Because death, as well as life, is an emergent characteristic of a resulting processing of information by a perceived grouping of information, it's a word that is technically applicable to all perceived groupings of information that are perceived to have morphed into a new perceived grouping of information with different emergent characteristics. The morphing of the new perceived grouping of information that exhibits new characteristics signifies the death of the previous perceived grouping of information. And since it's all about information and the information processing mechanism, the emergent characteristic death isn't exclusive to living organisms. Thus, terms like death of a star or death of a battery are acceptable.